Every puzzle has an answer.
When I ponder what Pokemon could become in the modern era of gaming, I imagine this vast freedom of an open world reminiscent of Breath of the Wild, where players are free to craft their own unique adventures and explore at their own pace. Populating this world would be actual visible Pokemon roaming about the landscape and ready to be engaged in similar fashion to something like Dragon Quest or Xenoblade, which would breathe new life into each distinct geographical region with type specificity, so like fire Pokemon near volcanoes, bug Pokemon in forests, etc., etc. I picture an enhanced version of Dark Souls' multiplayer system fused with Zelda's shrines, so players could find tens, even hundreds of secret bases, perhaps even smaller gyms littered around the world that incorporate online data and Pokemon from other players to form unique, unpredictable challenges. Of course, trainers could form secret bases or gyms of their own and submit them online for others to challenge. These would implement decoration and customization tools from something like Animal Crossing for added stylistic flair, which would expand beyond the costume design options already present in Gen 7. And considering the Pokemon universe has expanded to include many types and trainers, such as Battler, Breeder, Coordinator, Scholar, Photographer, and Ranger, among many others, taking a page from games like Octopath Traveler or Fantasy Life, by adding a job system and different progression routes, could offer the freedom for players to approach Pokemon according to their own interests. This is something that the series has always been proud to show off in the anime, with characters like Ash, Brock, and May all having very different goals, but it's typically shied away from in the mainline games, favoring battling first and foremost. This is the Pokemon game I've always dreamed about since I was a kid, and I genuinely believe that this is what Pokemon could be on the Nintendo Switch. And then I look at what the franchise has given us in the past half-decade. We've got 2 consecutive, linear, blatantly rushed, and unfinished generations that hold the player's hand while trying to introduce shallow gimmicks due to a lack of creativity. I look at what we're about to see in the near future, a Gen 1 pandering, oversimplified spin-off that nobody really asked for, debuting as the console's first major HD entry. I look at Pokemon's recent past and near future, and I have to ask, how is it possible that other behemoth franchises like Zelda and Mario have received renaissance revivals like Breath of the Wild and Mario Odyssey on the Switch, but Pokemon, arguably the most marketable and lucrative property for Nintendo, continues to stagnate on the sidelines with unambitious projects like Pokemon Let's Go? Why has a game with this much untapped potential been content to settle for mediocrity? Game Freak, what are we really doing here? Not that there's anything wrong with spin-off titles. I mean, some of the series' finest entries have come outside the mainline RPGs, but it's easy to see at a glance that Let's Go lacks the innovative spirit and ambition of other successful spin-offs such as Pokemon Mystery Dungeon or Pokemon Conquest. Forcing the player to bring a type-advantageous Pokemon to gyms, removing held items and abilities that make each Pokemon feel unique, eliminating battles with wild Pokemon altogether, and buffing Pikachu with moves like Low Kick? What? That allow it to defeat rock types simply by virtue of being the mascot, are all new features that seem like unambiguous steps backward. Allowing the game to essentially play itself because you don't trust the player to understand type advantages that have existed for 2 decades now is not good game design, no matter your audience. If you want to teach kids how to play a game in 2018, use the method that turned countless generations of kids into diehard fans in the first place. Have them play the damn game and learn on their own. The basics really aren't that hard to grasp. I know the game is intended as a stepping stone to bring Pokemon Go players on board for Gen 8, but that seems like a kind of ridiculous concept if you really think about it, right? I mean, Pokemon Go is already an effective bridge to introduce casual audiences to basic Pokemon gameplay and draw them toward the mainline RPGs, and it evidently did its job, if Sun and Moon's massive sales boost over X and Y is any indication. Yo, it's me again, from the future. Last time, I promise. I unfortunately discovered just now during a final fact check that what my past self just said, well, it isn't exactly true. Turns out the chart I was looking at counted Ultra Sun and Moon under the sales for both Sun and Moon proper, which resulted in an extra 8 million units that gave Gen 7 an edge overall. So, in reality, X and Y have, in fact, outsold the original Sun and Moon with 16.34 million units sold, compared to the latter's 16.13. Just wanted to be transparent that I was wrong about that, and I apologize now that I've caught it a bit too late. However, that still doesn't exactly invalidate my point now, does it? Because this means despite releasing in 2016, Sun and Moon have nearly sold the same amount of titles as X and Y, which launched in 2013. So this shows that the original Alola titles have sold at a much faster rate, thus indicating a spike in popularity. So, sorry for the accident, but the point still stands. That's all. Bye! Creating a second bridge title by stitching together some unholy Frankenstein's monster of both Go and traditional Pokemon gameplay is awfully redundant and pretty awkward. Furthermore, it's taking precious development time away from a game that could be truly special and innovative, which would truly grab people's attention and earn even more money in the long run. Remember Breath of the Wild? Remember how bold that game was and how it's all anyone could talk about for months? Yeah. Remember how Breath of the Wild is now the best-selling Zelda game of all time? That could be Pokemon. Projects like the Let's Go titles they're just not gonna get it there. That seems to be a more or less common sentiment when it comes to those games, though, so it likely doesn't warrant further discussion. However, I earlier described the generally more beloved Generations 6 and 7 as blatantly rushed, unfinished, creatively drained, overly linear, and easy. So let's transition into a discussion on those games' failure to progress the series in truly meaningful ways before Kalos and Alola diehards start roasting me in the comments. It's vital to fully analyze these points of contention, to fully understand how even the mainline Pokemon games have strayed from the series' solid foundation, and why the stagnation is now starting to approach dangerous levels of complacency. To clarify, no, neither Pokemon Sun and Moon nor Pokemon X and Y are outright bad games. It's far from it, actually. Gen 7 finally addressed some archaic game mechanics, such as removing cumbersome HMs, and even though I would assert that X and Y are the series' weakest entries, those games began the challenging process of overhauling an iconic art style into 3D, while expanding upon and streamlining Pokemon's enormous potential for online multiplayer. Neither game pushed these improvements nearly far enough, though. Even in Sun and Moon, the reworked animations and art design can feel stilted and awkward, especially with the protagonist's lifeless facial expressions feeling at odds with the game's story in many instances. Nothing pops and emotes like the sprites did on the DS, especially regarding the main characters having actual expression, meaning the developers still haven't managed to solidify a fluid art style in 3D. I find myself getting really nostalgic for the gorgeous sprite work in Gens 4 and 5 that demonstrated so much with even one animation, and they will most certainly age better than the clumsy character models in the 3DS entries that are oftentimes restrained to one or two jarring facial expressions. Pow is especially guilty of this. God, he sucks as a rival. The multiplayer editions, while more convenient, still feel excruciatingly limited compared to what Pokemon's online experience could be, and that's before considering the more robust additions I suggested in the introduction. Even before thinking about that massive revamp, some notable and obvious modes somehow remain absent. How is it possible that modern Pokemon doesn't feature an online tournament mode in 2018? Where is the ranked system to encourage players to be the best there ever was? Why can't we get a true free-for-all mode that, for a lack of a better explanation, isn't just completely terrible? It's also worth addressing the tragedy of tedium that is EV and IV grinding, or for those of you not attuned to the competitive side of things, don't worry, this is the only time I'll get into this stuff. Breeding endless eggs to get a Pokemon with perfect genetics, which we call IVs, and level grinding that Pokemon against the same cryptic wild Pokemon over and over and over and over and over again, until some of its stats gain a significant boost beyond what they normally would be, and we call those EVs. This process is practically essential to stand a chance online, but believe me when I say it is, without a doubt in my mind, the single most dull and monotonous prerequisite to competition that I've ever encountered in any game. It takes hours to hatch even one viable Pokemon. Competitive battlers don't even do it anymore. They opt instead to hack Pokemon into their games, and it's impossible to blame them. Yeah, I know players can circumvent this by using Super Training, which is a minigame introduced in X and Y to train EVs, and also Hyper Training, which is a Pokemon Daycare-esque station introduced in Sun and Moon, which trains IVs, but these are also both incredibly tedious and boring. Super Training is just tapping on your DS's buttons like a madman, like you're playing freaking Mario Party minigames until your Pokemon magically gets better EVs. The level 100 and bottle cap item requirement to even activate Hyper Training demands a cumbersome slog to train every Pokemon you want to fight with to maximum levels, which takes forever. Besides, nobody wants to sit through this when the levels are automatically fixed online anyway. Just let us do it right away, Game Freak. What's with the war of attrition against the players? Okay, so here's a hypothetical fix. By introducing a Pokemon breeder job system as suggested earlier, EVs and IVs could instead be mapped to how breeders groom their Pokemon. Trainers could leave their Pokemon with breeders at an online daycare controlled by either other players or a CPU if it needs to be fast, and the latter could take requests for how to raise them. which in turn would maximize the desired EVs and IVs accordingly. Gameplay for this could be an expanded version of Pokemon Ami, or the admittedly adorable pet simulation aspect of the Let's Go games. It's arguably their most heartfelt and endearing feature thus far, and I really do quite like it. I'm no game designer, but it only took me 5 minutes to type out a paragraph proposing an idea for IVs and EVs that, at least in theory, seems much more involved and interesting than what we currently have. And that's just me. I'm just some random loser on the internet. So imagine what Game Freak could do if they actually set their mind to it. The point I'm trying to highlight with all this is that even the strengths of Gen 6 and 7 were only small little baby steps towards where Pokemon needs to be, is not the final destination, and in more than one instance, the included improvements remain significantly flawed. The changes that both Sun and Moon and X and Y presented are overall minor tweaks. They're works in progress, built on the solid gameplay foundations established in earlier titles. The games are still fun, because Pokemon is inherently still a winning formula that many will be content with regardless, and thus they are solidly entertaining games. And to provide full discretion, despite being underwhelmed, I would say I overall still enjoyed my first playthroughs of both Y and Moon. However, the leaps and alterations made by both Kalos and Alola in comparison to the advancements made in earlier titles, in Gens 2 and 4, are relatively small, minor, and not yet fully functional. In other words, their unique strengths are few. Sadly, the weaknesses present here are anything but. It's about time we discuss the numerous shortcomings of the previous 2 Pokemon generations, and why the persistent failure to address them in favor of releasing games as frequently as possible has robbed this series of some of the magic it used to generate. This is the meat of this video, so buckle up.
Gotta get the go, gotta get the cash, gotta get the go, gotta get the cash, gotta get the go. Body for a price, just say so. Gotta get the cash.
It's fairly obvious that after designing 7 unique regions, over 800 individual Pokemon, and tweaks to core gameplay non-stop for the past 20 years, Game Freak is a bit creatively drained at this point. In all honesty, it's hard to blame them, but this problem has only escalated to the point of becoming a truly noticeable and limiting issue on the 3DS. This is likely because development time for the more sophisticated graphics and online features ultimately demand more significant attention in addition to artistic design. But despite this, both X and Y and Sun and Moon released just 3 years after their respective predecessors to meet the growing demand of a new console install base. That's 1 year less than the 4-year interval between generations 3, 4, and 5, which all featured less dramatic visual and performance changes, essentially way more work but far less time to complete it. This, combined with the final product we got, with both Kalos and Alola, leads me to my first and arguably most important complaint about the 3DS era of Pokemon that needs to change going forward. It's highly evident that both Gen 6 and Gen 7 are rushed to meet consumer demand, and in many cases will forever remain unfinished. There is no hard evidence or quotes outright confirming this, but the circumstantial evidence provided by the games themselves are damning enough to make this fairly transparent. First, Kalos introduced a grand total of 72 new Pokemon, while the base Alola games gave us 80. This is provided you don't count Mega Evolutions and Alolan forms as entirely new Pokemon, which I do not, because they're only design tweaks based on existing models. 72 and 80, respectively, might seem significant, but after Unova delivered a whopping 156 newcomers in the previous generation, both X and Y and Sun and Moon feel barren in comparison and are, in fact, the only Pokemon titles set in a new region that fail to reach triple digits for their sum of new Pokemon. This has several drawbacks. Since there's a scarcity of newcomers, Game Freak resorted to recycling older Pokemon to fill in the gaps, and trick people into thinking either region was fully fleshed out. You get a bunch of Pidgeys and Zigzagoons in early routes in X and Y. In Sun and Moon you get like Caterpies and Ladybuzz in Route 1, etc., and that continues for the entire game in both regions. This hinders the sense of discovery that should come with exploring a new region because roughly half the Pokemon the player encounters are creatures they've already become well acquainted with in the past. In turn, this reduces the lasting impact of both Kalos and Alola because a major part of their identities becomes mixed and muddled with older generations. This will become a pattern. Compare this to Unova, which successfully forged its own path by presenting new Pokemon exclusively until postgame, thus forcing players to familiarize themselves with a new cast and gradually appreciate Gen 5 for the novelty it offered rather than the tradition it relied upon. Even Sinnoh, despite utilizing a decent number of older Pokemon in its campaign, began by introducing players to entirely new Pokemon in its earliest routes: Starly, Shinx, and of course Bidoof. This ensured that trainers would warm up to newcomers early, and likely use several for the duration of their journey. The 3DS games just plop Gen 1, 2, and 3 Pokemon anywhere and everywhere, outright giving you an additional Kanto starter in X and Y, which disincentivizes experimentation and familiarization with the new. If new Pokemon are the heart that give each region its lifeblood, both Gen 6 and Gen 7 are suffering cardiac arrest. This is only exacerbated by the lack of legendaries that slowly but eventually trickled into the game's post-release. When Pokemon X and Y launched, the list of new legendaries were as follows: Xerneas, Yveltal, Zygarde. That's it! Every other catchable legendary in the game hails from Kanto, including Mewtwo and the legendary birds. Forget comparisons to Unova, Sinnoh, Sinnoh, or whatever else. The original Red and Blue contained more original legendaries upon release than X and Y did 15 years later. Of course, other legendaries came after launch: Diancie, Hoopa, Volcanion, Hoopa Unbound. What is Hoopa Unbound? Anyway. But the barren state upon release and resorting to downloadable legendaries after the fact is clear evidence that X and Y were rushed to shelves. To compensate, they relied on Gen 1 nostalgia pandering to cover for Kalos's lack of discovery and post-game content. Alola was admittedly far less guilty of this with the inclusion of the Tapus and Ultra Beasts, so I'll give credit where it's due. But it still trickled legendaries out rather than including them in the base game, and is guilty of featuring an underwhelming post-game. Which is a perfect segue for talking about how both generations are plagued with, well, underwhelming post-games. There's really not much to analyze here. X and Y unlocks the Battle Maison after completing the main story, and Sun and Moon offers the Battle Tree, but neither entry presents much noteworthy outside of those already lackluster features. The Battle Maison is just a blander, overall worse version of the Battle Frontier experience we've had for years that's still somehow required for essential items in competitive play. At least games like Diamond and Pearl had partner stat characters from the story to team up with in the Battle Frontier for some enhanced world building and emotional attachment that justified some earlier gameplay segments. But the Battle Maison is a bare-bones snooze fest that, from what I gather, nobody especially liked. The Battle Tree is exactly the same, but this time it includes some returning trainers from older titles such as Red, Blue, and Best Champion Cynthia. However, their inclusions feel much less impactful than, say, the epic build-up to fighting Red and Heart Gold and Soul Silver, an encounter added outside the Battle Frontier to incentivize exploration in a game that wasn't rushed and had time to flesh out its world and content. Whether that's the cause of some nostalgia-bait advertisement tactics that spoiled the surprise, or significantly nerfing these trainers from the challenges they used to be, the point is that the Battle Tree still feels dull and reductive in comparison. However, the disappointing Battle Frontiers hardly matter considering that we've been living in a post-Johto world since 2000, and anything less than an additional region to explore in the post-game should feel underwhelming, since Gen 2 accomplished it on the freaking Game Boy Color. This isn't demanding too much, hardly, considering Game Freak accomplished its best post-game 18 years ago, not only acknowledged but replicated it with a remake in 2009, and he's yet to even try giving us anything close to that since. It absolutely blows my mind that Pokemon fans don't call Game Freak out on this when every new game gets released. It is entirely lazy and inexcusable that a game in this same franchise released nearly 2 decades ago completely obliterates modern entries in terms of content. If there's any indication that Game Freak doesn't spend nearly enough time developing Pokemon games, if there's one clear piece of evidence that modern Pokemon is completely and utterly rushed, it's that right there. Look, I get that contemporary games take far more effort to develop than Game Boy Color games did, but if that's the case, you take the time to make it great. Breath of the Wild didn't become a masterpiece by being rushed to the deadline. It took 5 years to develop and experienced multiple agonizing delays along the way. If Pokemon wants to escape this cycle of mediocrity and create something truly special and memorable, I'd advise doing the same. You want Sinnoh remakes? Great! Me too. Make them, and include them as a new region during Gen 8's post-game content, where the final boss is Cynthia touting a level 100 Garchomp. You won't do it, Game Freak. You're too afraid to do it, but you should, and we should be holding them accountable for that kind of quality, even if it takes years to get the next entries. Instead, we sit back and let half-hearted, glorified DLC that nobody asked for, like Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, get released at full market price while taking development time away from a game that could be truly special if given proper time and care. Something that old quote from Shigeru Miyamoto about rush games being bad forever. As an aside, to end this section, I'd like to take this opportunity to note that X and Y were the only mainline RPGs without a proper sequel, even though Pokemon Z was clearly meant to be a thing, based on the naming convention to fit the 3D handheld, and Zygarde being the mysterious third legendary that the Pokemon sequels always feature. Instead, the Zygarde features that were likely supposed to be included in a planned Pokemon Z, such as the Cells scavenger hunt and alternate forms, were relegated to side quests in Sun and Moon. The mysterious absence of Pokemon Z further shows that Game Freak breezed through Gen 6 to get to Gen 7, rather than taking the time to refine and perfect Kalos the way it did other regions with games like Emerald, Platinum, and Black and White 2. The insultingly half-hearted Ultra Sun and Moon demonstrate a similar approach to get to Gen 8, only worse, because not only did Game Freak not try, but it also released its negligence as a retail product expecting consumers to cough up $40. And of course, we ate it up. But it's time to stop. These games are so obviously rushed, and it's now becoming a problem. Oh yeah, forgot to mention, in Sun and Moon there is only one route theme for each of the 4 islands. One.
All that noise.
In general, I actually love Gen 7's soundtrack, but guys, come on. If that doesn't scream rush, nothing will. To begin this section, I mentioned that modern Pokemon's rush development is arguably the greatest problem it needs to address moving forward, and that's because the expedience in which these games are being delivered only snowballs into causing and perpetuating other problems that further harm the overall gameplay. I firmly believe that if given more development time, Game Freak could craft the next evolution of Pokemon that would blow everyone away. However, as it currently stands, rushing to get the next entries to store shelves has prevented the company from slowing down and methodically coming up with fresh, compelling ideas that could potentially reignite the series' spark. That lack of meaningful creativity in the 3DS Pokemon titles is the second major problem that I'd like to highlight. I know what you might be thinking and expecting me to criticize here, as many fans cite it as an elephant in the room of modern Pokemon regions, but to be clear, no. I'm not talking about Pokemon designs when referencing Game Freak's creative stagnation. Tons of negative rhetoric gets tossed around whenever new Pokemon get revealed, complaining about uninspired designs, and while it's somewhat obvious that more work goes into certain Pokemon than others, these things are extremely subjective and based on a false preconception of what Pokemon designs quote-unquote should be, according to different generations people internalized growing up. Every generation has its winners and duds, and any given Pokemon could be classified into either of those two categories according to personal taste. I earlier talked about how the lack of new Pokemon can harm a new region, but the quality of each individual Pokemon design is a different issue entirely and up to the player to decide for themselves. No, I'm not here to critique artwork, I'm here to critique gameplay. More specifically, gameplay alterations in Gen 6 and 7 that feel at best incomplete and at worst uninspired. Let's start with the big ostensible selling points of both generations that failed to offer significant upgrades to the battle system like many hoped they would. Mega Evolutions and Z-Moves. Mega Evolutions already gave the impression that Game Freak was running short on innovative ideas because, let's be honest here, at least conceptually, they are a blatant ripoff of the series' longtime rival, Digimon. They are temporary power boost transformations that can only be used once per battle and reset after the battle ends. Sound familiar, no? However, even with that in mind, strong execution and a distinctly Pokemon take on the formula could have made Mega Evolutions... Megalutions? I don't want to say Mega Evolutions every time. I'm just gonna go with Megalutions. They made Megalutions the next major change to the battle formula. At least on paper, they seem like a compelling enough inclusion and a clever chance to raise normally overlooked older Pokemon to relevance with buff stats and new abilities. Unfortunately, the way Game Freak went about implementing the idea in X and Y eliminated any chance of Megalutions becoming anything more than a gimmick. So the optimal way to sufficiently cement this mechanic as a staple of the battle system moving forward would have been to give every fully evolved Pokemon a Megalution, ensuring that players receive maximum team customization options while giving their opponents more to consider during a battle. Each player would have to deduce which of their opponent's Pokemon would be the one to eventually Mega Evolve based on contextual clues like team composition, team order, etc., essentially adding more of a mysterious wild card to battles that would challenge trainers to think. This is the only method in which Mega Evolutions could become a truly dynamic and compelling change to the battle mechanics, because they would then introduce a new variable that requires an extra layer of wit in order to accurately analyze and overcome. Successfully predicting and counterattacking your opponent's Mega Evolved Pokemon in this system would feel immensely more satisfying, like making a hard read in a fighting game. Instead, due to the unfortunate scarcity of Mega Stones in the game, a simple glance at your opponent's team is usually all you need to determine which Pokemon will Mega Evolve, which essentially changes nothing about how you approach a fight. All that's changed now is you know a specific Pokemon on their team will receive an immediate buff, and you can easily expect and account for it without thinking that hard. So, I understand this is imagining an ideal world in which games are easy to develop, but sadly this isn't, and they are not. So while I still insist that delaying Gen 6 as long as possible in order to fully realize this concept would have been better in the long run, I also fully admit that this would have been an extremely demanding creative undertaking, and understand why they couldn't pull this off immediately. I do suspect that the developers could have slowly introduced Megalutions for other Pokemon as free DLC after releasing X and Y to help alleviate this issue, similar to what they did for Legendaries, and they could have kept going into future installments. However, the least Game Freak could and probably should have done as consolation is to prioritize Megalutions for Pokemon that truly needed them in order to thrive. While this is true for some of the Pokemon selected to receive the upgrade, such as Steelix, Pidgeot, and Beedrill, there were far too many Megalutions provided to Pokemon that were already considered overpowered, such as Garchomp, Blaziken, and somehow even legendaries like Rayquaza and Mewtwo. What? This ensured the opposite effect became reality more often than not. Instead of shortening the gap between the strong and the weak to help ensure a more balanced roster, in many cases, that divide became even greater. It's almost as if Game Freak was blindly throwing darts at a board to determine which Pokemon would make the cut, without even considering what it would take to make Megalutions worthwhile additions even as simple balancing tools. This idea ended up as a disappointing effort to tweak Pokemon's robust battle system. This is without even comparing it to something like Gen 4, which successfully overhauled combat by splitting attacks into physical and special varieties. Megalutions were mostly ignored, if not scrapped entirely in Sun and Moon, after ultimately failing to engage a different line of thought or provide a meaningful change to battles. They've ended up as a missed opportunity due to a lack of creative execution. Like many things in Sun and Moon, Z-moves improved upon Gen 6's big concept, but still didn't take things far enough to be considered groundbreaking. Every Pokemon has the capability to use one of these superpowered moves, provided they're holding an aptly named Z-Crystal. This accounts for the mysterious variable component I described earlier, while giving some weaker Pokemon an extra boost so they can pack a punch, if only once. Unlike Megastones, Z-Crystals add a risk versus reward system that is less obvious and therefore more exciting to consider. Do you abandon your normal held item to go all out on a big attack, or do you play it safe, abandoning that ace in the hole? Mega Evolutions were almost always direct upgrades, but Z-Crystals are more ambiguous and therefore more interesting. So every problem is fixed, right? We've solved the issues with Mega Evolutions. Z-moves are the next major step in Pokemon's combat, right? Well, not entirely. First, there are only 20 Pokemon in the entire game with Z-moves unique to them, which is an exceptionally low number even compared to Mega Evolutions. Of course, as you likely guessed, Pikachu and Eevee are among them. Of course, the mascots got a buff. Of course they did. Every other Pokemon has to use a type-dependent Z-Crystal for either a generic buffed attack or status move. While those options provide welcome versatility for non-attack heavy Pokemon, it would have been nice to see Game Freak use some more creative juice to expand on this and at least give more unique Z-moves to Pokemon native to Alola. This would have given the player incentive to use more of the new Pokemon and discover their new attacks. In turn, this likely would have increased the player's attachment both to those Pokemon and the region they inhabit, as a result of feeling more special than the recycled non-Alolan Pokemon with generic Z-moves. Again, except Pikachu or Eevee and Snorlax. Whatever. Second, every time you activate a Z-move, you're forced to sit through an unskippable cutscene that is entertaining the first time you watch it, but unbearably tedious by the 100th. This one basically speaks for itself. Although the attack animations in the 3DS games are a considerable upgrade over older generations, Z-moves pushes them a bit too far. Please add an option to skip these next time, Game Freak. Sometimes I just want to battle. Third, while I ultimately think scaling back the Mega Evolution concept into singular moves was a smarter choice to better realize its potential, the drawback is is that Z moves feel like an insignificant alteration to the battle system as a result. I'd again like to invoke the physical special attack split introduced in Sinnoh as an example of a meaningful overhaul to Pokemon's combat that changed the way players considered and executed battle strategies. This allowed previously ineffective Pokemon a second chance at viability, which opened up limitless customization options for trainers to experiment with. It was a simple, yet efficient creative change that liberated Pokemon to evolve in complexity based on the mechanics established in previous titles. And that's the downfall of Z moves. Though they offer a smarter alternative to Mega Evolutions, they barely build upon the combat itself, feeling insignificant rather than a true game changer. After all, Z moves are simply that, moves. You're essentially equipping your Pokemon with a beefed up TM. While it looks flashy and packs a punch, not much has actually changed mechanically. Players don't have to consider new Pokemon or strategies that naturally come with the increased options that Gen 4 provided. Instead, with Z moves, the same strategy works unchanged from before, only your strong go-to move is now just way stronger. They inflate the stats of certain moves, whereas Sinnoh changed how moves work altogether. When games aggressively push new mechanics that don't feel like significant upgrades or necessary changes, players will be quick to label these inclusions as gimmicks. Considering how often Gen 7 shoves Z moves into your face, and how little Z moves actually do to alter the combat system in meaningful ways, it's fair to say that they come across as gimmicks stemming from a lack of creativity. Now, full discretion, I'm of the opinion that outside of some balancing tweaks, Pokemon's combat doesn't really need many alterations to stay fun, or at least mechanically satisfying. After all, I happen to believe that around Gen 5 was when Pokemon peaked, and Unova barely changed anything about combat from Sinnoh outside of speeding it up, which, thank you for doing that, Unova. Gen 4 was so slow. Despite this, it's fairly obvious that by introducing Mega Evolutions and Z moves, Game Freak desperately wanted to build upon Pokemon's combat in meaningful ways. However, Mega Evolutions' poor execution prevented that change from becoming reality in Kalos, and the low impact of Z moves meant that the battle system could not progress as intended in Alola. Game Freak's desire for change was thwarted by its own lack of creativity, instead resulting in what felt like cheap gimmicks with minimal staying power. We will return to both Mega Evolutions and Z moves in a bit to discuss their greatest downfall, but for now, let's focus on what I just said. A desire for change thwarted by a lack of creativity. Prior to the release of Sun and Moon, Game Freak emphasized in their advertising campaign that change was coming to Pokemon's tried and true single player after nearly 20 years. Most noteworthy among these changes was the absence of gyms, replaced by what are known as island trials. Hooray! We all ignorantly cried before release day. Finally, Game Freak is taking some risks and changing Pokemon's format to make it more fresh and interesting. Maybe now, we'll have new things to look forward to. And then the game's released. No, we all exclaimed, bamboozled once more. No, Game Freak, this is just the same. Only somehow way worse. To be blunt, island trials fail as a replacement for gyms. This is primarily because they are exactly the same thing as gyms, only lacking the components that made gyms feel special. There have always been two main components of progression in gyms. First are trainer battles that build up to the final showdown while providing some extra XP if needed. Second is the gym leader boss fight itself, which ideally provides a challenge by testing the player's ability to think outside the box beyond simple type advantage. Unova's Elisa is an excellent example of a well-executed gym leader battle. Though players would expect that a ground-type Pokemon could easily sweep a gym that utilizes electric types, Elisa uses Emolga, an electric flying dual type, meaning ground moves are rendered useless. Subverting that traditional type advantage expectation like this forces players to think more creatively if they want to claim a badge from Elisa and progress in the story. In comparison, island trials barely change anything about this formula, and actually detract from it more often than not. There are still two main components to these trials that are very reminiscent of progression in traditional gyms. Mechanically, not much has changed. The contextual difference here is that trainer battles have been swapped out with wild Pokemon encounters, and gym leader bosses have been replaced with, well, also wild Pokemon encounters, except this time the wild Pokemon are on steroids. There are many problems that occur with this change, such as taking the XP boost from trainer Pokemon out of the equation, lowering the amount of Pokemon you have to defeat in order to clear a trial, and normalizing what previously felt like a special challenge by instead having you fight wild, neutral Pokemon in the same manner you would on any given route. But by far and away the two greatest offenses here are that island trials remove that rivalry component of gyms and often fail to provide a creative challenge. resulting in a replacement that often feels anticlimactic and mundane. Let's start with that second point. There are a few instances of trial boss Pokemon, also known as totem Pokemon, that replicate the challenge of a gym leader like Elisa that forces the player to think outside the box. Typically, type advantage will win you the fight up front, no strings attached. A water Pokemon will win you the fire trial against Salazzle. A fire Pokemon will dominate the grass trial against Lurantis. An electric Pokemon will sweep the water trial against Wishiwashi with ease. This pattern continues throughout much of Sun and Moon. It's worth mentioning that there are two notable exceptions of totem Pokemon subverting type advantage. Vikavolt is an electric bug type that can avoid ground moves thanks to its ability Levitate, and Mimikyu is a ghost fairy hybrid lacking the dark type weakness that usually cripples ghost gyms. Unsurprisingly, these are the most compelling fights in the entire game, and examples of trial challenges that Sun and Moon needed so much more of in order to remain satisfying throughout their duration. Oh, by the way, Vikavolt gets replaced by Togedemaru as the electric totem Pokemon in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, which is instead 4 times weak to ground moves rather than immune like Vikavolt was. Game Freak turned one of the most interesting fights in the game into a cakewalk. What was the point of those games again? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to outright glorify gyms from older titles as inherently superior. Every generation has had its fair share of easy throwaway gyms, especially during the beginning of each game. But the point here is this. If Game Freak wanted to overhaul the gym system in Sun and Moon, the island trials failed to do so because they're way too similar to what was already established. Accepting this inability to innovate, the next best thing would have been to refine and improve island trials to make every challenge engaging, rather than a handful of standouts. But only 2 out of the 7 totem Pokemon actually offered a challenge worthy of thought and consideration. So not only did Game Freak fail to change the system, it also failed to improve it. Totem Pokemon are therefore similarly flawed to Z moves, more bombastic versions of normal mechanics that fail to actually challenge or change the way players think. Bigger, but not better at all. Even the successful totem Pokemon in Gen 7 lack the context that made gym leader battles feel exciting. That missing context is human adversity. The best boss fights in past titles consolidated challenging gameplay into the form of a human rival with strong build-up and execution, which offered strong incentive for players to train and win. To demonstrate this, let's examine a gym that executes human adversity extremely well. Blackthorn City's gym from Heart Gold and Soul Silver, led by the Dragon Master Claire. Claire is the final gym leader players must face before challenging both Lugia and the Elite Four, and Ho-Oh, I guess, which immediately incentivizes victory in order to reach the main story's climax as fast as possible. But Claire herself is no slouch, and the game makes this clear as you progress through the gym, thus building anticipation for an exciting challenge. First, upon entering the gym and talking to the NPC to the right of the entrance, he'll inform you that she uses powerful dragon Pokemon that are mythical, sacred, and very difficult to damage. This establishes that the player is in for a challenge and that Claire herself is a trainer with much renown and esteem. Immediately upon hearing this, I want to fight Claire, both to discover just how strong her Pokemon are and to prove that my Pokemon are stronger. The competitive connection is instantly established. Making my way through the gym's pool of capable trainers, I'm further incentivized by dialogue they exchange before and after battle. One opponent claims that dragons are creatures of life itself and that if I'm not serious, I won't be able to beat them, which builds further anticipation for the ensuing battle with Claire. Another trainer states that she trains with Claire, and this gives her the confidence to win, which shows that other trainers have immense respect for her strength and are made better by battling with a trainer of her skill. In addition to building further anticipation, this tells me that by fighting Claire, I'll become a stronger trainer. I want to become a stronger trainer. I want to fight Claire. A third boasts that his chances of losing are less than 1%, which is obvious Pokemon NPC nonsense, but it also shows that these dragon trainers are proud and confident. If Claire is their teacher and their leader, she must be the proudest and most confident among them. She probably believes that her chances of losing aren't just less than 1% like this humble fellow, but 0% altogether. I want to prove this notion wrong by defeating her as an underdog and seeing that cockiness crumble. All of these interactions and emotions build immense anticipation for the boss fight itself by focusing on defeating Claire. Not defeating her Pokemon, but defeating her as a trainer and a rival. Respect, admiration, self-improvement, and arrogance are all factors establishing adversity and incentivizing progression before the battle even starts. The ensuing showdown does not fail to disappoint. Immediately, everything that was previously hearsay about Claire is confirmed with her opening dialogue, in which she claims to be a tough challenge compared to even the Elite Four, while oh so graciously labeling herself the world's best dragon-type master. She's dead wrong, but that's beside the point. This adds some extra incentive for the player on top of the previous build-up, but the ending of her monologue is what's most crucial here. She eagerly challenges you, while proudly declaring that she will use her full power against any opponent. On top of everything we know about her thus far, this part is critical. Claire does not want you to succeed. She'll do everything in her power to ensure that you fall, here and now. This legendary trainer, brimming with confidence that everyone has utmost respect for, is coming at you full force, your ultimate adversary thus far. If you want to progress, you're gonna have to earn it from a person who thinks they're better than you, who thinks you're weak and unworthy. Bring it. The battle itself lives up to the hype. Claire's signature Pokemon is a Kingdra that will likely overlevel most, if not all, the player's Pokemon by this point in the game, unless they've spent serious time grinding. On top of this, Kingdra's water subtyping makes it neutral to ice moves, which was, at the time, the main kryptonite for dragon types, as fairy type had not yet been introduced. So it also challenges players to think outside the box as previously described. As players gradually start to chip away at Kingdra, however, they'll start to notice that they're also chipping away at Claire's facade of confidence. When her final Pokemon reaches low health, she'll comment in disbelief, scoffing, "You're kidding, right? I'm supposed to win. I already decided." Upon the player's victory, she'll refuse to accept defeat, insisting that there must have been some kind of mistake. On top of completing a challenging boss fight, witnessing Claire's cockiness and doubt in your ability deteriorate as a result of your own strength and hard work is immensely satisfying. This is the result of her fantastic build-up and characterization. Claire isn't just a placeholder obstacle on your journey. She's a human rival with emotions, a goal, and a strong reputation that all work toward motivating the player to try. She's a great example of strong writing coming together with well-designed gameplay to create one of the most memorable gyms in Pokemon history. If you're wondering why I've just spent like the last 8 minutes or so analyzing a lone gym battle from 2009, it's because I need to emphasize that Sun and Moon's Island Trials have none of this. Nothing I just described that made Claire so memorable is present within Gen 7's replacement for gyms, because all you're doing is fighting wild Pokemon that have no characterization. All that emotional build-up motivating players to overcome a rival or superior trainer disappears when you're fighting nameless, neutral wild Pokemon that exude minimal presence or defining traits. As such, Island Trials come across as boring because they lack the context of human competition that made gyms feel significant. Rather than feeling like I'm taking the next major step in my journey by taking down a great trainer trying their hardest to defeat me, I feel like I'm being used for pest control. I'm not proving my worth as an underdog trainer, I'm disrupting an ecosystem to do menial tasks like gathering berries and taking photographs. Island Trials are an intriguing concept that would have been better realized in something like the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games. In those, the varied mission structure focuses on assisting fellow Pokemon with everyday life, and would be much more conducive to these trial activities like gathering certain items or taming rage-induced Pokemon as boss battles. Additionally, the player is able to communicate with other Pokemon as characters and peers, possessing thoughts and emotions, which allows something like Totem Pokemon to develop as exciting competition, similarly to a gym leader in the mainline RPGs. Hypothetical thoughts aside, as a substitute for gyms, it's clear that Island Trials nearly always come up short. I should take this moment to address the elephant in the room here that I'm sure many people are screaming at their computer screens right now, that being the Island Kahunas who act as Sun and Moon's gym leader boss battles. These encounters are certainly more climactic than the Totem Pokemon, but several factors hold most of them back from reaching the heights of a good gym leader. First, they're removed from the trials themselves, which eliminates a great deal of build-up toward their boss battles. I suppose you could view each separate island as one big gym, comprised of several trials leading to the Island Kahuna, but that also introduces some really fragmented pacing issues that also distracts from this build-up, as these Kahunas aren't always present and are rarely the player's challenge at hand. Their fights just kinda pop up as a bonus at the end of each island in most cases. Second, they're way too easy. I mean, Olivia's team still consists of pretty laughable mono rock types even halfway into the game, and the remaining Kahuna fights only fares slightly better. Even then, it's very likely the player's Pokemon will thoroughly outlevel a Kahuna's entire team without much effort, especially if experience share has been turned on. Third, and most crucially, it's very apparent that nearly all the Kahunas aren't that interested in defeating you. In fact, they seem to want you to beat them more often than not, which reduces that important rivalry component. This casual or even playful tone is established by the music that plays during these battles, which emphasizes whimsy over an important showdown. It's still great music, but compared to gym leader battle themes from like Diamond and Pearl, Black and White, or even X and Y. It fails to set the mood for a climactic encounter. 3 out of the 4 island kahunas also disappoint in this regard. While I don't want to stray too off topic here, while we're discussing Pokemon music, the champion themes in these games follow a similar paradigm. These climactic themes are ideally supposed to reflect the intimidating presence of a Pokemon master, determined to take you down at all costs, radiating confidence and strength, designed to disrupt the player's own by instilling nerves and fear in their place. Cynthia's theme is the perfection of this ideal, the pointed, rough, even haunting beats of the DS, setting the stage for a hellishly difficult encounter, which is fitting for how strong of a final boss she is. Arguably the best in the franchise. Just listen to how intense this music becomes, and remember how much it elevated your emotions in this unforgettable showdown. Music is incredibly subjective, but in my opinion, Cynthia's theme is the strongest orchestration in the entire series, with Gen 4 featuring the best soundtrack overall, close call with Gen 5. Gen 1 and 2's final battle themes also succeed in this regard. In comparison, both the final themes of X and Y and Sun and Moon are absolutely laughable anticlimaxes that fail to invoke any intensity or emotion from the player. I apologize if this seems like a random aside based on a personal grievance, but music is particularly meaningful to me in video games, and I wouldn't forgive myself if I finished this script without addressing how the DS titles completely obliterated the 3DS ones with their incredible soundtracks. Vast Pony Canyon's theme is a banger though, not even I can deny that. Anyway, returning to the disappointing Kahuna encounters, right, 3 out of 4 are disappointing. Hala insists that he's going all out before the first Kahuna fight, but he reappears in the Elite Four, reassuring you that this time around, he'll actually be giving it his all, meaning the first battle with him was simply meant as a formality to get you to the next island rather than as a serious challenge. Olivia has a similar issue. Her rematch in the Elite Four indicates she was holding back a lot in the second Kahuna fight, retroactively taking all tension out of that encounter. You know during a second playthrough that she could mop the floor with you if she wanted to, but she chooses not to in order to let you succeed, which feels condescending. These narrative problems could easily be addressed by creating new characters to be part of the Elite Four, but Sun and Moon opted not to do so. Nanu straight up doesn't care about being a Kahuna in the slightest, which makes for a fun character, but not a very compelling boss fight. He seems more interested in going home and finally relaxing than properly assessing you, outright stating that he's exhausted and advising you not to take the battle too seriously. He's very relatable, but his indifference takes away the battle's competitive edge. He feels like the kind of guy who would give players a free pass, even if they lost, simply because he didn't want to go to the trouble of battling again. Of course, this isn't actually the case, but even so, it's hard to get invested. Out of the 4 Kahunas, Hapu is the best by a country mile. She appears every once in a while throughout your adventure, determined to become stronger after not being chosen to inherit the Island Kahuna title from her grandfather several years ago. This motivation is revealed very late into the game, which reduces some of the build-up, but her connection as a rival competitor looking to beat you and become stronger is still way better handled than her fellow Kahunas. After becoming Pony Island's Kahuna, she challenges the player as her first test, insisting that she'll give you her full strength, which is easily believed considering how hard she worked to achieve this position. She isn't going to disregard the responsibility like Nanu did, and it's clear that a Kahuna's strength is the apex of her power thus far, meaning she can't afford to hold back like Olivia and Hala could. It actually kinda creates this pseudo role reversal where Hapu feels like the challenger attempting to prove her worth as a Kahuna by challenging you, the trainer who's garnered a strong reputation throughout your trials. It almost feels as if you're the final boss of Hapu's journey, and you gain the perspective of something akin to a gym leader. It's a small but neat subversion that changes things in a positive way. Her fight is still way too easy and begins very abruptly, but this is one of the few times I feel Game Freak executed a creative decision extremely well in Sun and Moon. It's a shame the other Island Kahunas couldn't replicate this success, cause 1 out of 4 just doesn't cut it. So, Game Freak's attempt to change gyms was commendable, but it ultimately lacked the creative energy to successfully implement Island Trials and Kahunas as satisfying replacements most of the time. Instead, the formula feels almost exactly the same as before, but noticeably hollow compared to earlier entries. And that's a pattern you can easily discern throughout the majority of the 3DS Pokemon games. Intended change that eventually falls back on tradition due to a lack of creativity. Island Trials tried to change gyms, but ended up mimicking the same framework regardless. Z-moves and Mega Evolutions tried to alter combat, but in practice the battle system remains largely the same. X and Y introduced Sky Battles. Wow! Now I can play the game exactly the same way, with absolutely no changes that could potentially come with a new arena, only now my Pokemon choices are reduced to those that can float. Surprise! The evil villain team in Alola isn't actually all that evil. Instead, the main antagonists are just a different evil team. Sun and Moon do not initially have a Pokemon League, which seems to indicate that the usual Elite Four endgame won't be the case this time around. But eventually Professor Kukui forms Alola's League, meaning the process is exactly the same. The game promises change, but returns to the familiar rather than committing. These games continuously present this facade of change, but in practice Pokemon remains mostly the same game it's always been. At this point, Game Freak's lack of creativity is becoming painfully clear. Perhaps it's a byproduct of having to rush development, but it's a creative drought regardless, and the games are suffering for it. The third major major concern I have with Pokemon going forward, based on the games we received in the 3DS era, is that the series has regressed in difficulty and exploration, often opting to hold your hand through an easy, linear adventure. The linear exploration is easy enough to address because it is painfully obvious when matched up against Pokemon's best previous entries. You really only need to look at various routes in the DS titles compared to the 3DS ones to see the tangible evidence for this problem. For example, let's examine Route 29 from the Johto region, specifically from Heart Gold and Soul Silver. This route is the holy grail of starting routes in Pokemon games. It has everything a new adventurer could hope for. Patches of grass in which to find your first wild Pokemon, trees to headbutt for the same purpose, a berry tree to discover in the northwest, alternate routes to Cherry Grove City that vary with ease depending on your access to HMs, and items on the ground for the player to earn with some exploration. There's even a weekly event players can return to after defeating the first gym, in which a trainer named Tuscany will appear every Tuesday, giving players several items as a reward for backtracking. Most importantly, in the northern part of Route 29, you can discover a pathway leading into Route 46 with even more wild Pokemon to find. Players won't be able to access most of this route until later in the game, but it promises much more adventure to come and provides access to far more team versatility early on. Johto's first route demonstrates everything players can gain from looking around, such as new Pokemon, items, berries, trainers, and new routes. This incentivizes environmental exploration in a non-linear region, which will hold constant for the entire game. It also shows that this region is packed with tons of varying content, thus bringing it to life. Other first routes in Sinnoh and Unova achieve similar goals even if they aren't quite as excellent in terms of overall design. Route 201 in Diamond Pearl Platinum is shaped like a T, presenting two possibilities for exploration. Players can choose to explore to the left or right after emerging from Twin Leaf Town to the south, the former leading to Lake Verity and the latter progressing the story in Sandgem Town. Lake Verity appears mysterious at first, but will house an important legendary Pokemon later on, so the mystery upon discovering it will eventually pay off, similar to Route 46 in the Gen 2 remakes. There aren't many items or trainers to discover on Route 201, but there's plenty of grass to find new Pokemon, all of which are native to Sinnoh, which builds excitement for a new region. Unova's Route 1 mixes it up a bit. Though the path forward might seem incredibly linear at first, returning to it later after earning the HM Surf exposes an entire extra half to the area that leads to an oceanic Route 17. This successfully incentivizes backtracking and exploration similarly to Heart Gold and Soul Silver. This other part of the route is alluded to early on with a staircase that leads to nothing but lake water, hinting to players that there might be more to this area than initially appears during the tutorial. Naturally, items, trainers, and new Pokemon are plentiful on this route, especially considering Black and White's insistence on exclusively presenting Pokemon native to Unova, which, as previously mentioned, is a strength of those games. Now, to compare these well-designed opening areas with what were provided in the 3DS games, let's start with Kalos's first route.
Allow me to present my solution.
Ugh. Gross. This route is nothing. There is no reason for this route to exist. It serves as nothing but a segue between Vanderbilt Town and Aquacord Town. There are no items to collect, no trainers to battle, not even any grass to discover new Pokemon. It is the most linear of the linear, and probably the single most worthless route in any Pokemon title, establishing nothing for the player. It fails outright. But wait, some of you might be objecting. This isn't the real Route 1 of Pokemon X and Y. The true first area is Route 2. It's not fair to judge Route 1 for being the first route when it isn't even the first route, despite clearly being labeled as the first route. Well, there are counter-arguments I would offer in retort. First, if it isn't meant to be the first real area, then why is it here? There is nothing Kalos Route 1 offers outside of some decent yet generic scenery. All it accomplishes is wasting time back and forth between two starting towns. There's nothing to be gained here, and if it wasn't intended as a real route, it should have been scrapped. Second is that considering Route 2 to be Kalos's first main exploration area is also problematic because it too is utterly barren. It's nearly the same stretch of empty vertical land that Route 1 is, only with 3 patches of grass and 1 trainer to fight. Ooh. There are no diverging paths or items, and over half the Pokemon available to you in this route are recycled from older games, which again leaves a bad opening impression for exploring this new region. In fact, it makes me think there won't be any meaningful discovery to be had in Kalos whatsoever. Unfortunately, I'm not cherry picking here because that theme remains consistent throughout most of Kalos. Players consistently have to slog through long, linear stretches of empty land filled with recycled Pokemon that eventually just gets tedious. Many routes are too straightforward, caves are so linear as to feel entirely pointless, deserts are far too realistically barren, and even oceans feel vertical and lifeless. Some areas are better than others, of course, and nothing reaches levels as bad as the opening 2 areas, but those initial routes are sadly more often than not indicative of Kalos' linear and uninteresting design. There's certainly nothing here that even approaches fun exploration puzzles from older games like the Whirlpool Islands or Ruins of Alph from Johto. Hell, even the first cave you find in Johto, aptly named Dark Cave due to being obscured in shadow, has more compelling level design and exploration elements than most of what you'll find in the entirety of X and Y. It's fitting that Kalos contains an area titled Chamber of Emptiness, because that's kind of what it feels like to adventure through this region. Linear, lifeless, and lackluster. Now, okay, none of this is to say that linear game design is inherently inferior to an open-ended structure. In my experience, the opposite is actually true more often than not, because difficulty curves and level design are easier to execute with more rigid developer intentionality in place. But in a game series that has thrived on exploration and immersion through decades of fascinating world design, to see those elements largely absent from Pokemon's 3D debut was disappointing to say the least. It's one of the very few series I believe would inherently and immediately benefit from a well-executed open world that would offer players many options in how they wish to progress beyond the choice of what Pokemon to use. The potential for strong exploration elements and fascinating discoveries is just too high for this series to remain on rails. Alola's first route starts similarly straightforward, but it fares way better the further you delve into it, offering numerous diverging pathways, trainer battles, and items to collect. The branching path to the right of your first fork in the road simply loops you back to your house, which ends up feeling a little bit pointless, but several trainers and grass patches along the way keep things somewhat interesting. The left path takes you to Iki Town, and the center option promises a future pathway through Route 3. This isn't quite as strong as Johto, letting players actually explore a bit of Route 46, but it's similar enough to incentivize exploration in the future. The same can be said for the rocks blocking off the pathway to the south, which players will eventually be able to access after defeating Hala and gaining Tauros as a ride Pokemon. Overall, this is a significant improvement from Kalos' beginning, and I was relieved to see exploration being emphasized so early on my first playthrough. The problem undermining this stronger world design is that due to the heavy emphasis on story in Gen 7, Sun and Moon tend to hold the player's hand through the entire adventure. The waypoint on the Rotom Dex map will rarely stray far from view, even after moving somewhere else following a story event. Though this isn't inherently a problem, even getting close to the objective marker will trigger a story cutscene, meaning you can't make much progress without getting abruptly stopped in your tracks. And it will always trigger a cutscene, usually with Hau, Lily, or Kukui directing you where to go next, sometimes even bringing you to a new destination entirely. This creates major pacing issues. Right as it seems I'll finally be let loose to go enjoy my adventure, the game stutters and grinds to a halt to give me a new objective so it can stop again 5 minutes later and repeat the process. It's horribly redundant, and Gen 7 never finds its groove because of it. What's worse, the story in Sun and Moon isn't even all that interesting despite its attempt at subversion, and sometimes I just wish these characters never existed because they keep preventing me from exploring at my own pace the way I could in older games. Especially Hau, aka the most obnoxiously and unrealistically happy person, with no interesting character quirks to make him stand out in any way. Also Lusamine, whose only distinguishable quality as a villain is that she is crazy, which is the worst, most lazy villain archetype out there, and oh my god, the worst of them all is Lily, aka the longest and most intrusive escort mission in the history of Pokemon. She even stops to heal your Pokemon 3 times during Alola's equivalent of Victory Road. What's supposed to be the final major test before the Elite Four is rendered utterly pointless by Lily's impulsive need to treat you like a helpless infant. Maybe it's because the main character is a foreigner from Kanto that the supporting cast feel the need to guide you every 3 steps, but regardless, it makes me feel less like an excited adventurer and more like an infantilized tourist. This is quite a shame, as Alola itself is absolutely beautiful, both culturally and artistically, and it's a region I would love to have more freedom to explore on my own without constantly being interrupted by helpless partner characters constantly asking for help. Instead, it feels like I'm being led on a tour by developers that desperately want to show me the beauty of these islands through a linear method because they don't trust that I'll be able to discover it on my own in an open-ended one. It's an absolute waste of a fascinating world that the DS titles never really struggled with. It's also a problem that would immediately disappear upon transforming Pokemon into an open-world game. I'm just saying. The irritating handholding also obliterates the thematic integrity of the story itself, as the characters constantly remark on your overwhelming strength and hope that you'll put Alola on the map by becoming its first champion. But the gameplay consistently gives you free handouts and leads you in the right direction as if you can't function on your own. There's a buzzword critics toss around for awkward narrative clashes like this. It starts with an L, it's like Ludo, something, whatever. The linearity and hand-holding present in the 3DS Pokemon games contribute to a larger issue infecting the gameplay itself, which is that the main single-player offerings of both X and Y and Sun and Moon are incredibly easy to complete. I mean, guys, it's laughably easy to beat these games. To start this section, okay, I'd like to debunk several fallacies surrounding this topic, as it is commonly debated among fans. The first is that the root of the problem primarily stems from the reworked experience share system present in both generations. Previously, experience share was an item equipable only to one Pokemon in your party that allowed it to gain half of all experience earned in any battle, even if that specific Pokemon didn't make an appearance on the battlefield. This was useful for bringing lower level Pokemon up to speed quickly if you wanted to adjust your team late into the game. Gen 6 changed this mechanic. Now, experience share acts as a key item that provides every Pokemon in your party the same amount of experience earned by the one actually fighting, turning an all-for-one system into an expedited one-for-all process that essentially eliminates grinding. Many fans complain that this change ruined the challenge in Pokemon games, which is why you might be surprised to hear that I actually think this was a good idea. The new experience share alone didn't destroy the difficulty of modern Pokemon games, it only eliminated the artificial difficulty of level grinding. Anyone can mindlessly level grind their way to victory, but it isn't actually that hard to do, more so than it is tedious and monotonous. This only presents the illusion of challenge in the form of filler substance. The only difficult part is having the patience to put up with waiting, but in reality nothing is mechanically complex or mentally engaging. To quote Egoraptor's sequelitis on Zelda, "It's not hard, but it feels like it's something." The new experience share eliminates that, which opens up so many possibilities for the game designers to present genuine difficulty in more substantial ways. Game Freak ended up dropping the ball on that potential in these games, but this change at least provided the chance to evolve, and therefore I think in theory, it was smart. Plus, if you're such a traditionalist as to insist on level grinding being an essential part of the RPG experience, the option to turn off experience share is always present for you. The second common fallacy on this issue is a rebuttal, insisting that the only reason the 3DS games feel easy is because we've aged, and that in reality Pokemon has never been much of a challenge. After going back and playing through SoulSilver for this video, I can confirm that nothing could be farther from the truth. There are numerous difficult obstacles in the Gen 2 remakes that will harshly punish even veteran trainers for slight miscalculations or poor team composition. This is due to smart enemy AI and infuriating movesets that will actually capitalize on your mistakes, rather than throwing out moves at random with little strategic value. Battles will absolutely snowball out of control for the player if they aren't fully prepared, which in turn makes these encounters more satisfying to overcome. I earlier discussed subverting type advantage and used Claire as an example, but SoulSilver's difficulty extends much further into other game mechanics the players would never be challenged to consider in the 3DS titles. I can name many examples. The final battle against the Kimono Girls has you facing every evolution in rapid succession with no chance to heal in between battles like in the Elite Four. This not only tests that the player has a balanced team capable of handling many different types, but also if they have Pokemon with recovery moves or held healing items that can restore health in a pinch. Whitney's infamous Miltank will use Attract to infatuate male Pokemon into becoming useless punching bags, while it keeps using successive rollouts for exponential damage, easily sweeping any team if given room to breathe. This challenges players to consider status effects like paralysis or flinching moves to stop this potential onslaught. It also brings a Pokemon's gender into consideration, which is an often overlooked aspect of battling that players have to work around if they want to avoid getting pulverized by this jolly pink cow. The Elite Four showdown with Koga contains several Pokemon that challenge players in unique ways. The first is Forretress, which isn't incredibly threatening on its own, but Koga's ace in the hole here is that Forretress knows Explosion, a self-destruction move that will, in all likelihood, eliminate both Pokemon in the field in one fell swoop. However, the player cannot use a similar Oko move because Forretress knows Sturdy, an ability that ensures it cannot be eliminated by an attack that automatically kills. Unless the player can switch to a fire Pokemon quickly, they could face losing a valuable fighter, especially with Forretress's high defense. It will also use Protect several times to whittle your Pokemon's health down in the likely event that it's poisoned during this battle, which presents another factor to overcome while also introducing a strategy players themselves can use to avoid the explosion tactic. I lucked out here because my Scizor is strong against normal type attacks, otherwise this would have gone very poorly for me. Koga's Muck is a much harder shell to crack because its evasiveness can outright lose you the fight if you let it linger on the field for too long, but its bulkiness and recovery make it difficult to quickly defeat. Muck can and will abuse Minimize during this fight, which is a move that will stack evasiveness buffs every time it is used. By the third or fourth successful attempt, it will be rare to see any attack successfully land. Unfortunately, Muck's high special defense means it can be hard to eliminate before this happens, meaning unless you have a strong physical ground sweeper, Muck will likely use Minimize a couple times. If you miss any move during this crucial period, you might as well end your Elite Four run then and there. Not only will Muck keep getting harder to hit as it continues to raise its evasiveness, but the few hits you do land will slowly be undone thanks to Muck's held item, Black Sludge, that gradually heals it at the end of every turn. Altogether, it's a special tank with healing properties that you can rarely hit, which equates to a nightmare challenge demanding that players account for held items, the special versus physical difference, and how to counter evasion tactics. I had to fight this Muck alone for over 30 minutes. Because I kept missing after its evasiveness buffs, watching 4 of my Pokemon die in the process, including my Gengar, which struggled to death before the Muck finally succumbed to struggle itself. If my Gengar and Scizor weren't immune to poison, this battle would have been Koga's easily. Oh, not to mention, his signature Pokemon Crobat utilizes a similar strategy with Double Team, except it's much faster, thus ensuring the evasiveness buff will come into play, if not with Muck, then with another potentially lethal Pokemon, which almost cost me this match. Koga's battle strategy here is actually banned in competitive play for being too overpowered, but SoulSilver doesn't care about your complaints. SoulSilver wants to see you suffer. It has no problem kicking your teeth in with one of Pokemon's scummiest tactics because it is a very challenging game that expects players to think about every factor and prepare accordingly. The entire Elite Four is similarly competent at utilizing comparable strategies, even switching different Pokemon in to a type advantageous matchup every so often. The infamous Full Restore that they could potentially use once per battle introduces another strategic obstacle that players must navigate around, perhaps even intentionally whittling down a weaker Pokemon to red health to force the opponent into using it prematurely. In comparison, when pushed into a corner, Sun and Moon's Hala simply cures his Pokemon of paralysis rather than using a Full Restore and loses on the same turn. Huh. Odd. Even the exploration elements introduce interesting challenges the farther players progress in the game. Not only do the aforementioned environmental puzzles challenge players to navigate creatively, but it's also actually possible to sequence break the 5th, 6th, and 7th gyms in Johto by taking the road less traveled. Therefore, knowing if you're in the correct location according to the world's level progression and gym structure becomes a challenge. The more compelling design element here, though, is this encourages the player to, well, consider challenging themselves despite the obvious level disparity. Do you play it safe by taking on Chuck's fighting gym first, or do you head straight for Price, confident that your Typhlosion can defeat a gauntlet of stronger Ice-type Pokemon? Good luck beating him with fire types, as his Piloswine might have some surprises for you. Of course, the double edge to this sword is that actually managing to defeat Price before either Chuck or Jasmine makes those latter fights a cakewalk. But that's the player's reward for challenging themselves and coming out on top. Even Johto's world adds a layer of difficulty by asking players to consider how they should progress. So, altogether, SoulSilver offers major tests that challenges players in terms of team composition, recovery moves, held items for both your Pokemon and the opponent's, status effects, Pokemon gender, priority moves, speed, Pokemon abilities, protect tactics, evasiveness, the physical versus special split, type advantage subversion, and exploration. The game doesn't just tell you these things either, it beats you into submission with them in combat until you fully consider these mechanics and have them internalized. If you don't account for all of this at some point, you will struggle to beat this game, which in turn provides added depth to combat that makes the game far more thrilling and satisfying to overcome. Make no mistake, Pokemon can be really hard when it chooses to be, and the Johto remakes prove it has been legitimately difficult in the recent past with games that most people adore. Us getting older has nothing to do with it. Until the Battle Maison and Battle Tree start introducing trainers with some brains, X and Y and Sun and Moon lack pretty much everything that made a game like SoulSilver challenging and therefore satisfying to complete. Poor enemy AI is near the heart of the problem. It always made sense that wild Pokemon would make stupid decisions when battling because they lack training, but under the guidance of experienced trainers like Lance, Cynthia, or Getsis, you'd expect them to become stronger and that their trainers would use this strength in an organized, intelligent way in combat to maximize efficiency. Even normal everyday trainers should offer a more involved battle than that of a wild Pokemon. This isn't the case in X and Y or Sun and Moon, as trainers will often commit to the dumbest, most random tactics imaginable that wipes away any illusion of a challenge in nearly every encounter. For example, take this mini-boss against Plumeria. Upon learning she's about to send out her signature Pokemon Salazzle, a poison fire type, I decide to use Primarina, a water fairy hybrid, meaning both Pokemon have a type advantage over the other. I have water over fire, she has poison over fairy. To start the fight, I use Aqua Jet, which is super effective and almost kills, meaning I executed on type advantage, but she uses Flame Burst, which does next to nothing, despite the fact that she could have used Double Slap to deal out more damage. For some reason, she doesn't have a poison move on her Salazzle. It has a normal type physical attack that doesn't match this Pokemon's strengths whatsoever. I then decide to toy around by using Disarming Voice, just to see if she'll use any smarter options in the few moves before this Salazzle dies. She starts by using Toxic, which is a horrible play considering her last Pokemon is nearly fainted and won't be around long enough for poison to deal any real damage. Her next turn is another Flame Burst, which again does next to nothing. For the parting blow before my last Disarming Voice wins the battle, she uses, you guessed it, another Flame Burst. Each Flame Burst has inflicted 13, 15, and 14 damage respectively for a total of 42, plus 21 damage to account for the poison, for a total of 63 damage across 4 turns. Now, if Plumeria had instead chosen to use Double Slap 4 consecutive times, a move that hits potentially 5 times in one turn with neutral damage, that would be up to 124 damage assuming I continued to cheese the fight with Disarming Voice. Perhaps even more considering those 20 potential hits introduce a larger window for critical hits to land. This is all to say, Plumeria's AI is dumb as rocks. It fails to adapt to the situation or even to use simple math for anything close to an optimal strategy. This isn't anything fancy or technical either. We're just talking about a damage calculator that should be very easy to implement for turn-based AI nowadays, or at the very least, teaching the AI not to keep using type disadvantage moves that barely leave a scratch when better options are available. To make it clear, I outright tried to lose this one-on-one, and I still won, barely scathed. Once you realize you can intentionally throw battles and still win, this entire game goes into autopilot and stops being interesting. I wish I could tell you I was cherry picking here, but sadly I'm really not. There are many examples from my few hours of footage alone that show rival trainers committing to the most nonsensical options available to them. This dude uses Assurance, a super effective move against my Alolan Raichu that inflicts modest damage, but then instead goes for Aerial Ace on the next turn, which isn't very effective and does next to nothing. Why not just use Assurance again? This Team Skull Grunt uses Psych Up to copy my Alolan Marowak's stat changes, but it's the first turn of the battle. There can't possibly have been any stat changes yet to copy. Perhaps he thought I'd go first and try to use a stat buff, but I'm paralyzed, so that line of thinking also just makes no sense. Here we have a Chad Swimmer using a water poison type, Tentacruel, and bragging about his water-based tactics, which I again decide to mess with, using my own Salazzle, just to see if this time the AI will grasp the fact that one type advantageous water move will knock my Pokemon out. I keep nasty plotting just to kill time, and lo and behold, he never once uses a water type move, opting instead to pick poison attacks that accomplish next to nothing. Upon falling below half health, he uses Barrier, which strengthens regular defense despite the fact that Salazzle is a special attacker and I've done nothing but raise my special attack this entire battle, therefore rendering this move completely pointless. He still refuses to use a water type move for an easy KO. Eventually I get bored and Flame Burst this water Pokemon to death just to rub salt in the wound. I could keep going, and guys, we'd be here all day. The point is, enemy AI in these games is inexcusably bad, and once the player sniffs out this facade, all tension is removed from the entire experience. So now, not only is the game ensuring that players possess significant mechanical advantages over the world, we'll get to this, but it's also dumbing down the world itself even further to widen this gap and make it next to impossible to lose. Look, I know the older games weren't all as flawless beacons of exemplary AI and regular trainer battles either, but in that case, it should be significantly better by now. Instead, we have gotten drastically worse here. It's at a point when battles no longer involve thought from the player or the AI that Pokemon starts to become a dangerously passive snooze fest, and it's this exact threshold we've now crossed in Gen 7, leading into Let's Go, which looks to somehow dumb things down further. When moments like these occur more frequently than not, it seriously makes me question what the point of modern Pokemon is anymore, aside from raking in revenue, and it only cultivates my inner cynic. Pokemon, of all things, should never, ever feel like that. Of course, this is only made worse by the fact that players will be over-leveled in nearly every encounter, and this is where the frustration with experience share arises for most people. I mentioned before that this new experience share is a great idea in theory, and I still hold firm in that assessment. However, theories mean little without proper implementation, and Game Freak failed to stick the landing in executing the new experience share because neither Kalos or Alola were buffed accordingly to account for this player advantage. The protagonist received a major boost, but the world didn't change, which led to the unbalance. A potential solution to this would be to have a dynamic open region that evolves alongside the player to keep encounters interesting even in earlier areas, similar to what Breath of the Wild attempted. I know I probably sound like a broken record with that comparison at this point, but I seriously cannot emphasize enough how many smart design decisions from that game could be used as a basic blueprint for Pokemon's own future. Balancing a Pokemon world like this would be tricky because the games work on a leveling system similar to most RPGs. If the region is constantly growing alongside you, this risks rendering level progression entirely meaningless outside of evolving and learning moves. However, after thinking about it for a while, I still think there are ways to make something like this work, which would in theory fix Pokemon's currently non-existent difficulty curve. Again, I'm not a game designer, but this is what I've come up with for better or worse. First, I would suggest making every wild Pokemon the player encounters roughly the same level as the strongest Pokemon in their party, give or take a couple levels for variety. Wild Pokemon were never the challenge of these games in the first place, guys. They're opportunities to develop or add to your team at best, and annoying obstacles at worst, but it's highly unlikely that anyone with a full team will get swept by any lone wild Pokemon that isn't a legendary. Therefore, balancing them alongside the player sacrifices little in terms of making level progression matter. Instead, this provides trainers easier access to late-game team adjustments, rather than forcing them to level grind a weaker Pokemon for hours in order to switch things up. Eggs would still account for creating a Pokemon from scratch, should players desire more customization options. Additionally, long dungeons like Victory Road would become much more challenging due to buffed obstacles, which in turn makes repels and escape ropes more valuable, and early areas infested with obsolete weaker Pokemon would remain relevant for the entire game. This concept does ignore Nuzlocke formats, but considering how popular those playthroughs are, it's surprising that Nuzlocks haven't received a separate mode entirely yet. Adding such a mode and keeping wild Pokemon levels static during it, similar to what we already have, would easily accommodate players who prefer both Nuzlocks and change. In the case of shifting to an open world where Pokemon roam free, I would highly suggest Game Freak look to the Xenoblade games for how to design a living, breathing world where even early regions and enemies remain challenging for the entire game. Take Gormott from Xenoblade 2 as a great example. Rex and his team arrive here early on, and therefore can only realistically take on the lower level monsters wandering around. However, medium and high level monsters also populate the plains here, which means return visits to this area will never feel meaningless, as there will always be challenging enemies to fight. This can be a huge pain during the beginning of the game, as higher level creatures will aggro the player and wipe them out in one hit out of nowhere. However, unlike in Xenoblade, Pokemon's turn-based combat allows trainers to easily run away from encounters, which eliminates this issue. Are you starting to realize why I keep insisting that Pokemon should change to an open world format? Are you, like me, now increasingly baffled as to why it hasn't done so yet? Anyway, moving on. Second, I would issue level caps for challenging gyms, specifically banning any party Pokemon that exceeds the level of the gym leader's strongest fighter. I think limiting the player to however many Pokemon the gym leader currently uses would also be necessary to ensure that we don't have full teams going up against 2 or 3 Pokemon. This essentially evens the playing field as much as possible to create a fair fight that necessitates strategy above level grinding, provided the boss fights actually have AI that tries to win like in SoulSilver. What I've proposed here is essentially the opposite of what the Let's Go games have done. Rather than taking every possible step to force feed the players an easy win, my method challenges them to earn it themselves. If this sounds a bit too much like punishing players for improving, an alternative option is to equalize all Pokemon levels within a gym, similar to how online battling works, but that also approaches dangerous territory of making levels not matter. Perhaps Game Freak could implement a system similar to Final Fantasy XV or Xenoblade 2, where experience is gradually stockpiled and can be exchanged at Pokemon centers all at once to allow the player to gain direct control over level progression. This way, the people who want a challenge could opt to remain in the lower levels and use experience as a crutch, whereas the players who don't mind the system we already have can continue to challenge gyms with overleveled Pokemon for the sake of progressing as fast as possible. Normal trainer battles initially seemed like a tricky middle ground, but I think Game Freak could solve this with an expanded, faster version of the cell phone from Gen 2. This way, trainers from the early game who once provided a competitive fight can remain relevant throughout the entire story as they improve their Pokemon alongside the player. Johto actually came surprisingly close to hitting the bullseye with this one. Expanding the cell phone to all trainers would be my suggestion to perfect it. Yeah, so reading this back, it kinda sounds like I'm attempting to turn Pokemon into some sort of warped communist regime. However, aside from suddenly questioning where my economic instincts truly lie, I think equality is how you offer genuine challenge in a game like Pokemon. Artificial difficulty like levels shouldn't be the challenge, and equalizing them as often as possible opens the door for rival trainers to use other tactics, like in SoulSilver. A balanced and satisfying difficulty curve is one of the hardest goals to achieve for developers, and it's rare that any game genuinely pulls it off. But I think the handful that do manage it are fondly remembered as some of the best offerings this medium has. Linear turn-based JRPGs that use a level progression system will usually be restricted to keeping the player and enemies as closely matched as possible in order to achieve this. It may sound obvious, but giant level disparities in a linear and turn-based level system will either result in too much tedious grinding or an easy cakewalk to the finish line, neither of which are fun experiences for the player. The 3DS Pokemon games jumped way over the shark in the direction of the latter, with the experience share buff being handled so poorly, which is why my suggestions for reaching equilibrium through a more intimidating world are so drastic. The moral of the story is that Monolith Soft should develop the next Pokemon region. Moving on. The final nail in the coffin killing any sense of challenge in the 3DS games is, you guessed it, our old friends Mega Evolutions and Z moves. I mentioned earlier that we'd be returning to these mechanics to discuss their most critical flaw, and alas, here we are. The problem here is that Mega Evolutions and Z moves are almost entirely exclusive to the player throughout the main story, which ruptures game balance into oblivion and removes tension from most encounters. So in addition to growing stronger at a much faster rate that the NPCs can't keep up with thanks to experience share, players essentially have a get out of jail free card in the form of an ultra powerful transformation or attack for the rare instance in which they start to sweat. As in most cases, X and Y are the biggest offenders here. Throughout Gen 6's campaign, only 3 other trainers will have access to a Mega Evolution, those being Lysander with a Mega Gyarados, Diantha with a Mega Gardevoir, and Derival with a Mega Absol. Even counting that last one is a stretch because Absol technically doesn't Mega Evolve until shortly after the story ends, but even throwing X and Y a bone there means that only 3 encounters throughout the entire journey place rival NPCs on equal footing with the player. Only 3 battles in the entire story carry the potential to be fun. In every other instance, players would have to intentionally handicap themselves to make things slightly more interesting by choosing not to Mega Evolve in combat, but the knowledge that they're constantly holding back and could easily breeze through the game if they grew impatient still deflates that intrigue. It also doesn't help that X and Y are constantly shoving Mega Evolutions in your face, outright giving you a free Mega Lucario and a free Mega Evolve Gen 1 starter as a means of not so subtly stating, hey, we know type advantages are hard, and that you're a little slow, so here are 2 free ultra powerful Pokemon to start your adventure. Yeah, one of them is stronger than most legendaries. No, you don't have an option to decline. What? You're worried that this will make actual legendaries feel weak and insignificant? Nah, don't worry about that. Just wait until you see the insane power creep we're planning for the Gen 3 remakes to make sure that doesn't happen. The underlying issue with Mega Evolutions is that they're treated like some special, earth-shattering surprise in the rare instances when enemies have them, but the game undermines that mysticism by giving the player free Mega Evolution handouts around every corner, which leads to horrendously unbalanced combat for the duration and an overall boring game. Z-moves aren't as snake-bitten by this issue because you can only use them once, meaning the power disparity between player and NPC isn't as drastic. Pokemon abilities like Sturdy and moves like Protect also offer counterplay to having them outright OHKO the opposing Pokemon, so more strategy is necessary to use them effectively. In theory, this points to a far more balanced experience in Sun and Moon, which does end up holding slightly true, but it's still a significantly flawed system. For one, enemy AI often isn't smart enough to successfully implement the counterplay described previously. Far more troubling, however, is the same huge problem Mega Evolutions had, namely that there are not enough encounters in which NPCs have access to Z-moves, despite the player being able to utilize them shortly after starting the game. Granted, there are far more trainers throughout Alola who will eventually challenge you while possessing a Z-ring, such as all the Island Kahunas, all of the Elite Four, and your rivals. Through researching, I've also heard that some of the route bosses and ace trainers supposedly can also use Z-moves, but not once did any of them use one on me during my playthrough, which again points to poor enemy AI. In fact, all the trainers I just mentioned, the Kahunas, the Elite Four, my rivals, none of them use Z-moves in the entire game. They have the Z-ring, they have the capability to do it, but they just didn't. It's a much improved combat system that more consistently puts opponents on the same pedestal as the player and therefore leads to more engaging encounters throughout the story, certainly more than 3. However, there's still room to improve here because these battles remain the exception to the rule, as more often than not, enemy trainers won't possess this significant advantage. I usually don't allow myself to use Z moves, but as an experiment, I removed this handicap from myself for this trial in particular on my second playthrough because it gave me the most trouble on my first. Since Z moves can be utilized once per battle, this makes every wild Pokemon encounter leading up to Mimikyu an OHKO time waster. But the true crime here is how this ability destroys the battle with the totem Pokemon itself. At this exact moment, I'm already down 4 Pokemon against Mimikyu and its partner Haunter, and I've barely even managed to scratch the former. My only 2 remaining team members are Alolan Raichu and Primarina, neither of which is a particularly strong matchup against ghost types. All things considered, I shouldn't win this fight. I haven't considered enough to win this fight. I was underprepared and should be forced to start over with a better game plan, and that should be okay. Now, watch what happens when I use Primarina's Z move. One more Aqua Jet seals the deal. Boom. Done. Fight over. I win. Give me my Z Crystal. Did I earn it? Not in the slightest. I should have lost completely and utterly, but I'm still walking away with a cheap victory because Z moves provided me an unfair advantage. Of course, it's always possible to intentionally not use Z moves this way and limit yourself, which leads to a more challenging encounter. But in the back of my mind, I'll always know that the option to utilize Z moves to easily clear even the most difficult encounters in this game is always present, and therefore any challenge achieved by holding back this way feels fake and forced, a restriction I placed on myself to try and make the game feel better designed than it actually is. That is not satisfying. Before you ask, yes, this is different from an easy mode versus a hard mode in a game like Fire Emblem. In those games, if a level is too difficult and forces the player to switch to an easier difficulty setting, they cannot go back later on. They've given up and admitted defeat because those difficulty modes frame the entire experience, not a customizable fraction of it. The possibility of using a Z move to clear an otherwise hard trial carries no consequence and is thus inherently different. There are many ways Game Freak could have fixed this. For example, not letting the player use Z moves during trials, or presenting more Pokemon at once during a trial, like in a swarm battle, to ensure Z moves, which can only be used once, don't OHKO the only challenger and immediately end the fight. But alas, it did not do this. It's part of the reason Sun and Moon feel so uneven at times. Right when you think the games are coming into their own and finding a groove, they timidly limp back to some of the bad habits established in Gen 6, which leads to awkward pacing, lack of a satisfying difficulty curve, and overall, just inconsistency. If Game Freak wants to make any grand changes to Pokemon's combat while keeping the games challenging, it has to implement these changes across the board, all NPCs included. I think the company started to realize that when switching from Mega Evolutions to Z moves as the primary gimmick, but it still has a long way to go. Oh, and Game Freak, for a final cliff note on difficulty, please do not make it so Pokemon can land critical hits, survive certain KOs, and stave off status conditions based on how friendly they are with the player. Some Pokemon require friendliness in order to evolve, like my Alolan Raichu here, assuming it starts off as a Pichu, meaning if anyone wants to have an Alolan Raichu in their party, they're essentially forced into baby mode automatically. For example, here I misplay with Raichu against this Garbodor and end up with 9 HP remaining. What's more, the attack poisons Raichu, meaning it should not survive this turn. And that's okay. I deserve to lose this Pokemon for playing so carelessly, and I'll take it as a lesson not to make the same mistake twice. Except just kidding, because since Raichu and I are so buddy-buddy, it magically manages to overcome the poison, live, and OHKO Garbodor on the next turn. Please, Game Freak. These games are easy enough as it is without adding extra insurance cushions that let the player make as many thoughtless mistakes as possible without consequence. Never do this again. I'm certain there are some of you watching this right now insisting that Pokemon doesn't need to be challenging in order to remain enjoyable, and for those people, I'll say, that's great. I'm glad you're still able to have fun or even discover some relaxation through an easier world and battle system, and I'm not at all trying to say your method of experiencing this franchise is inferior to those of us thirsting for tighter gameplay. What I will claim, however, is that Pokemon's mantra, in addition to catching them all, has always been to become the best there ever was. Those were the lyrics we internalized from the anime, and that was the general philosophy that led to the challenge in older titles that all of us thoroughly enjoyed growing up. It's totally fine to not mind the more casual tone in the 3DS titles, or even in Let's Go, but that's not why a huge portion of Pokemon fans got hooked on the series in the first place, and that's why the title of this video is claiming that these games are losing their soul. Even if you appreciate the change in direction, these titles are abandoning what made Pokemon so special and addicting for so many of us in the first place, and for those of us who feel that way, this series has kinda become dull, distant, and depressing. It's no longer an issue I can simply overlook. If you are one of those fans scoffing at the notion of difficulty being so important in Pokemon, ask yourself this. If the games are essentially playing on autopilot like what we witnessed in the 3DS era, and if you're happy with this change, then what is the point of even having a battle system at all anymore? The entire reason to include combat is to challenge players and force them to improve, but when the battle system is as broken as it recently has been, players aren't accomplishing anything by overcoming adversity because that same adversity is only a test of patience rather than a test of skill. Therefore, regarding Pokemon's modern combat, why bother with the awkward middleman that satisfies nobody? For those of us wanting a greater challenge, the current battle system in single player is an utterly pointless exercise in monotony. For those of us whom difficulty means little, battling only distracts from the other aspects of games like Let's Go that emphasize collection and pet simulation. As it stands right now, battling CPU trainers is just a waste of time no matter what perspective you have on the issue. So if you're satisfied with the current trajectory the series is taking, what is the point? Is it nostalgia? Is it community? Is it an easy release of dopamine? If you don't want a challenge, why continue to battle at all?
Don't ask questions. Just consume product and then get excited for next products.
Gaming Brit created an excellent video detailing why challenge is the core of video games around the time Cuphead was being scrutinized for its punishing nature, and I highly suggest checking it out if you're so confused by the insistence on difficulty being essential for satisfying gameplay. I will link it in the description. The Pokemon RPGs are no different. If you're going to include combat in your game, as these titles always have, challenge is absolutely vital to ensure that players feel rewarded for continuing to improve. It's what separates this medium from other forms of entertainment, and without that draw, shallow battle systems will inevitably feel like a waste of time. The 3DS Pokemon games felt like a waste of time. And that's about all I have for criticism on Pokemon's 3DS era. Wow, that was certainly more than I bargained for. I absolutely did not expect this to turn into the comprehensive critique it eventually became. And I'm honestly surprised I fully finished it, considering how depressed it's made me regarding a series that's been crucial in defining a significant portion of my life. I love Pokemon, and I'm sensing that now would be a good time to remind everyone that I did indeed enjoy aspects of these titles during my first playthroughs. Okay, less so Gen 6, I'll admit that much. It's pretty obvious in my critique that I think Kalos is the worst region by a landslide. The overall purpose of this critique isn't to condemn X and Y or Sun and Moon as outright bad games though, is far from it. I simply want to provide convincing evidence that given the chance to represent the next major step in Pokemon's evolution, these games were not good enough and often took steps backward. Most of the attempted changes to the formula crumbled under poor execution or were treated to lesser versions of what came before due to creative shortcomings, and several design decisions actually detracted from what the DS era established, resulting in 5 years of stagnation with occasional bouts of regression. This pattern cannot continue once mainline Pokemon finally hits a powerful home console, and looking at the upcoming Let's Go games, I'm terribly concerned that it's going to persist on the Switch, perhaps even exponentially so. I suppose some of you might be frustrated with this video because you suspect I'm demanding too much of the developers considering my requests in the beginning. I would obviously disagree. A huge open world, roaming Pokemon, job systems, multiplayer gyms, and everything else I talked about in the critique are all tangible mechanics already existing in other games, and are thus entirely possible to pull off, even together. Hell, Dark Souls pretty much accomplishes all of this on its own. Not to be another one of those critics who compares essentially anything and everything to Dark Souls, but those games are often referenced for good reason. A company controlling a vastly lucrative property such as Pokemon should have enough resources to create a breakthrough game like this on stronger hardware if given the proper development time. Equally as important, we, the fans, should be vocal about demanding better rather than settling for mediocrity. If it takes time to design a creative, inhabited open world, Game Freak should take the time. If it takes time to craft a reasonable multiplayer system, Game Freak should take the time. If it takes time to add customization and replayability through job systems, well, you get the point. But if it takes the same amount of time to create 10 forgettable games in the span of 5 years as a replacement for a single truly special experience that fans have craved for what seems like an eternity, and if Game Freak actively chooses to pursue this route rather than listening to its devoted supporters, maybe the company needs to heavily consider how it's spending its time and resources before it fully alienates the people who believe it can do better. I would swap the entire 3DS Pokemon era and Pokemon Let's Go for a Pokemon game as memorable as Breath of the Wild in a heartbeat, even if it's all we received in half a decade, and I know I'm not alone in that sentiment. But why, you might be asking? Why would Game Freak need to change anything about Pokemon when it's practically guaranteed to be a bestseller? Well, honestly, you're completely justified in pursuing that line of questioning. Pokemon will continue to thrive financially regardless of how Game Freak proceeds on the Switch, at least for now. Only alarmists and idiots would try to tell you differently, and I like to think I'm at least not the former of those. Jury's still out on the latter. What I can confidently claim, however, is that moving into the home console market means Pokemon is no longer a big fish in a small handheld pond. The competition is about to substantially ramp up. That isn't meant as a derogatory sucker punch at handheld games, mind you. Many of my favorite games of all time originated on a handheld, and it's still my preferred way to experience the medium. But you cannot deny that critics and consumers carry different, oftentimes elevated expectations of what a home console game will provide, both in terms of overall quality and content. And oftentimes this results in bigger games that are judged without the caveat of hardware limitations. A Link Between Worlds is likely my favorite Zelda game of all time, but juxtapose it with Breath of the Wild and it looks meager in comparison. If a mainline Zelda that mimics Link Between Worlds was announced for the Switch right now, people would be disappointed. That doesn't make it a bad game whatsoever, but consumers expect more now. Pokemon faces this exact crossroads. X and Y and Sun and Moon appear as behemoths of content and visual finesse on outdated 3DS hardware, but if complacent games like those released for the Switch right now, disappointment would be palpable and audiences would turn a cold shoulder. I know this because the Let's Go games look to be exactly that kind of underwhelming debut, and people are understandably frustrated because Pokemon refuses to evolve into the big leagues despite now having that opportunity. As such, it's going to find competition much more suffocating on the Switch than it ever has before. Good luck getting kids to play a half-baked Pokemon game on a console that offers Fortnite for free. Good luck attracting competitive players on a system with a juggernaut like Smash Ultimate. Good luck getting anyone to remember Pokemon Let's Go when your competition is now suddenly Mario Odyssey and Xenoblade 2, rather than Mario 3D Land and a clumsy port of Xenoblade 1. It's for that reason I do not expect that these games will sell nearly as well as the 3DS titles, and though I can't openly judge them prior to having played the full release, I suspect based on the lukewarm gameplay footage we've received that people who do purchase Let's Go will need convincing reasons to jump back in and once again put their faith in Game Freak to deliver something worth their time and money. If the company remains complacent with these underwhelming releases, in other words if Gen 8 isn't a substantial upgrade or overhaul to the lackluster 3DS era, over time, Pokemon is going to start losing its dedicated fans and sacrifice its influence to imitations like Temtem that are making a tangible effort to improve the formula. If Pokemon remains the same, it will get surpassed on the Switch and eventually people really will lose interest, even if that moment won't come for several years. It's crazy to consider right now, which is why Game Freak obviously hasn't yet, but in this adapt or die industry, complacency is the slow dagger that bleeds companies into obscurity, and I do not want to see Pokemon or Game Freak go down that road. That's why the past 5 years of Pokemon really worry me, and why it needs to evolve sooner rather than later. We might not see or hear it yet, but the clock is indeed ticking. It's telling that the most popular software to come out of Pokemon in the past half-decade has been Pokemon Go, the mobile phenomenon that came surprisingly close to achieving world peace in 2016. Pokemon Go isn't a good game. It has shallow combat, poor multiplayer components, and lacked significant content upon release when it was peaking in popularity. All Pokemon Go did was tweak how Pokemon's exploration worked to take advantage of a mobile platform, a simple change that turned the entire real world into the next Pokemon region. However, that one simple change was enough to reignite people's interest in the series as they largely overlooked the game's laundry list of flaws to launch Pokemon to its greatest surge of popularity since the Game Boy. If a shallow mobile game like Pokemon Go can light the world on fire due to one ambitious change despite all of its shortcomings, can you imagine the possibilities of a mainline RPG holding that same ambition, only this time possessing the resources to fully realize it on an HD home console? Do you now understand what Pokemon could be on the Switch and why it needs to start aiming higher? More importantly, does Game Freak even dare to anymore?
Power that's in my hand. We all live in a Pokemon world. I wanna be the greatest master of them all. We all live in a Pokemon world. I'll put myself to the test. I'll be